Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Good evening everyone, welcome to tonight's seminar by Dr. Andoni Piperoglu, who is speaking on the topic of Envisioning a Mediterranean Pacific, Photography and Sugarcane Migrants. The seminar planned for next week, an online seminar by Gary Bush on the massacre Calavrita, will not take place as unfortunately the presenter passed away. We only got the news a few days ago, so there'll be no seminar next Thursday. However, we do have two seminars in the following week, one on Monday the 26th of August and the other one on the Thursday the 29th of August, the usual Thursday slot. The Monday seminar will be held in conjunction with the Australian Archaeological Institute of Athens and will be delivered by Munich-based Professor Philip Stockhammer on Athenian society in the first millennium BC from a bioarchaeological perspective. The 29th of August seminar will be by lawyer Evgenia Mitrakas, and she'll be looking at the early years of the Australian Greek Welfare Society, which is today known as Pronya. With respect to tonight's seminar, I would like to thank our two sponsors. Firstly, the Kessler Region Association of Melbourne and also the Ethic and Philanthropic Society. And I invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. Also, just letting you know that the website for purchasing tickets for the October Film Festival has gone live. Get in early and purchase your tickets for opening night. This year we're also opening a new venue in Coburg, Palace Cinemas at Pentridge, so I hope to see all you jailbirds there. But now let's return to tonight's seminar with Andoni, Envisioning a Mediterranean Pacific, Photography and Sugarcane Migrants. Although sugarcane was brought to Australia in 1788 with the first fleet, it wasn't until 1862 that the first commercially viable sugar plantation was set up outside Brisbane. As the supply of convicts had dried up and most white settlers perceived the backbreaking work of cane cutting was beneath them, a source of cheap and compliant labour was required for the industry to flourish. This was made available by Pacific Islanders, mainly from Melanesia, places like Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, the New Hebrides, and also a few from Polynesia and Micronesia as well. Recruitment of islanders ceased in the early 20th century, but as demand picked up later on, Southern European migrants, especially Italians, but also Greeks, were brought in. The presentation today has a visual culture and comparative dimensions, where migrant labour of two diasporas in two different time periods, the two diasporas being the Pacific and Mediterranean, is explored through photo, sculpture and cartoons in the context of the dynamics of settler colonialism. A few words about our speaker tonight, Dr. Andoni Piperoglu, who I don't think needs any introduction. He's been a regular speaker on this sort of seminar circuit. He's of part Kazi, part Cypriot background. He's the inaugural Hellenic Senior Lecturer of Global Diaspora at the University of Melbourne. Andoni specialises in migration and ethnic history and has published extensively on Greek migration to Australia. He's in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies, where he teaches subjects on migration, diaspora, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism and globalisation. So if you know anyone studying at the University of Melbourne, please encourage them to look at Andoni's subjects as part of a specialisation stream or as breadth subjects. May I also publicly congratulate Andoni on his first academic monograph, which was recently accepted by Illinois University Press, titled Making Greek Settlers, Racial Inclusion and Exclusion in White Australia. Congratulations, Andoni, and I hope this will be the first of many. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight, Andoni Piperoglu.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Burrung peoples. I often say this, but I think it's important that I do to give kind of specificity and context. But my mother's family is from Cyprus. And because they're from Cyprus, are we good? Okay, bravo, thank you. Because I'm from Cyprus, I've kind of been schooled in a distrust, but also an awareness of what British imperialism offered and took away from my forebears. And because of that I think I've got a healthy distrust of colonialist regimes, and it's because of this cultural inheritance that I acknowledge that sovereignty was never been ceded on these lands. I'd also like to give a shout out to Nick Dallas. Running a seminar such as this requires a lot of work behind the scenes, a lot of labour by many people, often voluntary, and I think we can safely say that the seminar program is healthy. It invites a really interesting and wide-ranging group of speakers to talk on a range of topics. So I'm just going to get stuck into my talk, but I mean, as Nick said, and thank you for that wholesome introduction, which I think sets us up nicely for what I'm going to talk about today. So, yes, I have a book coming out, hopefully in publishing world, 2026, and it is called Making Greek Settlers, Racial Inclusion and Exclusion. And the book sort of looks at how Greeks engage with two agents of global change, of human migration during the early 20th century. I look at race and I look at what we call settler colonialism in academia. Settler colonialism merely meaning settlers that's come to stay, a distinct form of colonialism where people stay, they don't leave. It's different, say, from what happened in Cyprus, it's different what happened in, say, India. So I look at how Greeks are both included and excluded within the operations of British imperialism, Australian nationalism, which, you know, white Australia is a significant part. And I also look at how they identify with what we could call whiteness, how they see themselves and situate themselves within the politics of race. And so why a kind of reading of how they engage with the politics of race, as well as how ideas of Greece are attached to the politics of race. I look at how Greeks kind of challenged but also partook in the creation of white Australia. And they were frequently labelled as kind of less or non-white, and they reacted to this kind of questioning as in a kind of host of creative ways. And they drew on their pasts to situate themselves as permanently belonging. And those pasts are attached to, say, their civilizational heritage, the pasts related to their distinct Christian faith. But this past is also tied to how Britain understood Greece, and also how Britain had a vested interest in the Mediterranean world. And so I'm sort of sharing this because maybe I'll give a talk on my book at a later date. You've certainly heard me over the years talk about themes that are all kind of have made up the volume. But what struck me as I kind of did this research and wrote this book is that, interestingly, right, Queensland pops up a lot. And the most significant way that Queensland pops up in my book is when Greeks are responding to this quite infamous report, Royal Commission, that's called the Alien Immigration Commission report to inquire into the social and economic effects of the increase of the number of aliens in northern Queensland. And the Greek community in Brisbane really rallied and mobilised. And here's an example of them coming down to the capital here in Melbourne to protest what eventuated to be quotas placed on certain types of fruit from the Mediterranean region. This this forced me to think about the ideas of race that circulated between America and the United States, which kind of at this time in the 1920s put the idea of who is white into contestation and kind of defined the white race into subcategories of Nordic, Alpine and Mediterranean. And so they concluded in this report that Greeks were undesirable. They were undesirable for particular reasons. But I guess what I'm sharing here is that my research in one book has led me to do the research that I'm talking to you today about. And so I'm keen to kind of connect via a framing of diaspora, right? Two seemingly disconnected, but I hope to show actually quite connected subfields in Australian history, but also kind of global history. So that's the history of migration, and in an Australian context, we could think about that as overlapping with a history of ethnicity and ethnic groups, but also histories of colonialism. So I'm encouraged by works like this, North of Capricorn by famous Australian historian Henry Reynolds, and also the work of Regina Granta here, Mixed Race Relations, Asian Aboriginal Contact in Northern Australia. And kind of these volumes open up a space for me to consider the pervasiveness of ethnic singular framings of, say, Greek, Italian, Maltese, Lebanese, Spanish migrations to Australia's north, and consider how the mobilities from these regions constituted, if you will, a broader pattern of Mediterranean diasporic culture that was tied to the colonial dynamics of sugarcane cultivation. And I've also been reading lately these books, John Docker's 1492, The Poetics of Diaspora, Avtar Bra's Cartographies of Diaspora, Contesting Identities, which I shared with my student today, who's with us. And each have been particularly useful for me to rethink the methodological approaches to Australian migration history. So I'm kind of interested, if you will, of delving into what we could think of as diasporic cultural expressions in Australia, and tracing what I see as a lost world, right? A world that's sort of forgotten, not quite remembered anymore, that encapsulates shared diasporic experiences that, in my view, have been blurred or altogether kind of buried under what Ghassan Haj in this volume here, The Diasporic Condition, defines this kind of a created sense, right? That first there's migrants, then migrants settle, and then a diaspora is formed. Right? This kind of temporal process in time. Migration, people move, they stay where they move, and then they form some kind of new culture that's linked to this homeland, but also new in the space that they're now part of. And so this kind of emphasis, if you will, if we're thinking about the framing of how of history, right, puts the story that I just shared here of our diverse north sort of doesn't really account for the Southern European presence. It's very much about Asian, Indigenous interactions with the British colonial world. The Southern European story in Australian history is then talked about as a post-war phenomenon, and often then framed within the state-coined term New Australians. Like, this thing happened where Australia changed by accepting this Southern European influx, as if then the histories that predated that were never there. So, you know, this is kind of getting me to think about, how do I place a story of the Mediterranean world in conversation with a Pacific Asian world in tandem with a British colonial world? So I want to share this cartoon here from the New Zealand Observer, which comments on the politics of labour and small business keeping in Queensland, even though it's actually from New Zealand. And it's called a counter demonstration, and it reads, John Fruit Shop Chinaman to Dago Saloon Keeper. All lighty, you sign petitions, really good shop hours act, shutter up Britisher, give you and me plenty time, keep open, take your cash all night, all day. So here the visual commentary works together with the caption to portray an accented English use. It reveals how the slur dago, a term I've explored in some depth, and how it travelled between the USA and Australia, was used in tandem with another racial slur, John Chinaman. And it stresses how migrants from the Greek-speaking regions of the Mediterranean and Cantonese-speaking regions in southern China were represented as business scheming people whose working practices did not fit within the supposed fair and reasonable industrial working conditions for which Australian labour movements were advocating. Later, in 1925, the Cowra Free Press and many other newspapers in regional New South Wales, where many Greeks owned and operated hospitality venues, published this poem, the Pom Dago. I come up to Oz, you call me Pom, but it's sunny that it I come from. No open the ois, no cleaner the fish, no pillar the spud, no washer the dish. But cutter the shug and grow banan and make the man and cleans the lan. I like the bush, I like the smell of yucca the lipped and wattled as well. No speaker, no ing, you call me blob, but I know a quid from a zack and a bob. No care a damn for the lab or the nash, but I work like hell and make it the cash. So, read as a cultural meta-commentary, right? The poem, and there are many more like it that kind of play with this language, right? Bring to the fore a kind of mocking of an accented English use. The becomes da, for example, and it's giving off an impression that the mispronouncing of the lingua franca of the host society is reason for scorn, or the kind of Australian-esque rhyming tone and flows implies that the dago, whether Greek or Italian, was an identifiable racial type of worker that could be comically spoken for. Indeed, the voice employed in the Pom Dago reveals a proud, albeit contradictory, inability to speak English, but also a love of local fauna. Its straightforward rhyme structure evokes a typical bush ballad, narrating a story of heading up to Queensland to make quick money as an itinerant cane cutter, via language that's colourful, colloquial, and idiomatically Australian, yet due to the presence of an accented accent, the poem points to a Mediterranean diasporic presence long before, right, the post-war Southern European labour arrived to Australian shores. So viewing Queensland's Sugar District as a Mediterranean Pacific contact zone, I become increasingly interested in adopting, if you will, alternative methods and kind of conceptual tools that I have been picking up from diaspora studies as a means to interpret how processes of mobility and social exchange are intermeshed with broader historical phenomena. Phenomena like colonialism that have had kind of, we can see a very vocal contemporary backlash. I think a good example might be in 2020 when Scott Morrison said that there was no slavery in Australia, and he was shut down pretty quickly to say he doesn't know the full history of South Pacific indentured labour and how that can be understood as a form of slavery. And so here then we're kind of in the moment of some kind of global public, historical consciousness, if you will, in which these past colonialisms are kind of increasingly demanding contemporary redress and repair, right? And so this redress and repair are kind of detectable in a recent ABC documentary called The Black Hand. Has anyone seen it? No? You've seen it, Florence? So framing site-specific sections of each episode, the names of First Nations country are placed alongside the towns that were named during the colonial era. And violence of indentured labour from the South Pacific opens the documentary, kicking off a morbid tonal expression that leads to the documentary's exploration of an Italian crime ring in the far north. The documentary was backed up by the expertise of historians like Francesco Riccati, who spoke here last year, and Frank Bongiorno, perhaps Australia's most distinguished Australian historian at the moment, as well as insights offered by the University of Essex expert on mafia relations Anna Sergi and South Sea Islander descendant Sonia Manikin. So narrating the documentary's mafia story, however, is actor Anthony LaPaglia. Perhaps well known, at least to people of my generation, as being a sort of disassociated father in Looking for Alabrandi. So as a viewer learns about the infamous Black Hand, this mafia story, they also get to see LaPaglia coming to terms with his own diasporic consciousness. That is to say, the story, while very much presented as a kind of deep dive into this very specific case study of Italian crime ring in Australia, it also presents a personal narrative that emotionally ties, a LaPaglia to kind of a contemporary diasporic sensibility that many people, like us, say, from a Mediterranean region are tapping into, right? Via, say, nostalgic online social media platforms or Ancestry.com. There is something happening intergenerationally that people are kind of interested in accessing these past for various reasons. So as the documentary makes clear, during the early decades of the 20th century, and as also what Nick just told us, people from the Mediterranean region often worked in Queensland's sugar industry. An increasing number found employment as bush clearers, sugarcane cutters, they worked in the catering industry. They had, their cafes in the towns. But increasing number worked in the sugar industry as bush clearers, cane cutters, labourers in the refineries. And others managed to acquire their own farms. So here, a photograph taken on Lazaros Demetrius' farm in Nangai country near Ingham around 1918, the communal vitality of a Greek Cassarolesian settlement in regional Queensland is captured in the celebration of a baptism. Posing for the camera, a group of about 40 Greek men, women and children, two young Indigenous boys. Positioned between the shade of the eucalyptus tree and the large corrugated iron shed, the settlers gaze at the photographer, displaying their prized possessions of elegant suits and dresses, bottles of alcoholic beverages, and young healthy children. Destined for consumption by subsequent generations, or perhaps relatives back on Castellorizo, an island that many of you in the room know has a layered, checkered history of engagement with competing Ottoman, French, Italian and British imperialisms. The photographs captures a particular moment in the multifaceted encounters between the settlers and regional agricultural life. In relation to the politics of labour, the photograph represents a particular kind of performance. The men and women have brushed off the markers that would have scarred their hard-working bodies and appear relaxed and animated. Glasses of beer are elevated to toast the religious occasion, and the experiences of physically taxing labour typically associated with life on a cane farm have sort of been rendered invisible. The arduousness of their settlement on the sugar district that often supported so-called fringe communities of South Pacific Islanders and First Nation peoples is seemingly put to the side for the sake of a photographic inscription that asserts well-being and permanency. The religious occasion, if you will, also appears to represent respectable settlement while simultaneously declaring a kind of defiance to an expected Anglo norm. The holding of young children who sit on the knees of their male elders symbolises that traditional patriarchal kingship networks remain central to the upholding of their cultural traditions. In contrast, the inclusion of the young boys, the Indigenous youths, stands as a potent reminder of the intrusive colonial practices of European settlement in the districts. Their inclusion also suggests a form of cohabitation and familial connection was shared between the agriculturalists and the youths. No record has survived, to my knowledge, in the archive to indicate the extensiveness of their relationship. So I first came across this image in a self-published book, The Greeks in Queensland, A History from 1859 to 1945 by Dennis Konomos. Konomos was the son of a Greek migrant from Kythera who worked on the cane fields and was born and grew up in Toowoomba. Typical of self-published ethnic histories, the book is full of dense descriptive details, lacks a reliable referencing system, and offers little to no discussion of First Nations peoples, despite having 5 photos in which they're clearly visible. As I ponder over the image, I'm spurred to ask, who were these children, right? What were their names? Where are their parents? What was the relationship between them and the other young Greek youths in the background standing next to them? How did they interpret and partake in an Orthodox Christian celebration? As equals, as disciplined farmhands, as friends? In negotiating, in kind of neglecting to consider these important questions, ethnic histories often silence what we could think of as transcultural encounters and connections. So I'm curious to explore what is unknown in this photo, and I'm of the view that the site of labour, if you will, in Queensland's sugar districts, but we could also suggest, say, other contact zones in which labour and migration kind of intersect. We could think about the Snowy hydroelectric scheme. You could think about the factory floors of these cities as sites of intercultural exchange and interaction. So thinking about Queensland, though, I'm interested, right, in thinking about this space to offer something about how we can think about how a Mediterranean diasporic world forms outside of a Mediterranean space, if you will. And so I'm interested, and I draw on a range of different works. I just want to point to a few. A notion of shadow networks, and a way of thinking about assimilation in an alternative way. These are people assimilating into Australian Queensland society, but in doing so, right, we could think about them creating a kind of shadow assimilation. They are at once becoming British Anglo-Australian subjects, and at the same time, they are assimilating into something new, a new type of diasporic culture in which all types of interactions and exchanges occur. In the remaining time I have with you, I'd like to share a moment when ancient Greece was positioned as a type of civilizational apex in Queensland, while also comparing 2 photographs from the cane fields as a means to bring relatable historiographies into the same conversation. The story of South Pacific labour that Nick just shared with us, as well as voluntary and often transient. Like I just had a few conversations with people who have connections to the cane fields via this kind of transience, that there's a kind of temporary movement up there, make money quick, come back down. And I also am interested in visual culture. I'm also interested in a kind of material world. And so I'm interested in how migrants kind of perform, if you will, their migrancy, perform their assimilation, perform a new type of cultural identification. The images, say, I'm about to discuss, some of them at least, are circulated today via online media platforms, ethnic community publications. They're images that have a public awareness. Not the first one I'll talk about, the last 2, certainly. Okay. Just finally, be it through, say, architectural design, as we can see here in the building of Paronella Park, built by a Spanish migrant turned cane farmer, Joseph Paronella, south of Innisfail, on Mammal People's Country, or the naming of the Diamantina River, or the town Roma, named after Lady Diamantina, an aristocratic woman who was born in Corfu, and who arrived in Queensland after marrying the state's first governor, George Fergus Bowen, or contemporary land use like this communal olive grove, which proudly informs customers that their enterprise is run by, quote, third-generation Greek Australians whose great-grandparents, quote, migrated from the small island of Kythera in 1890 and 1930 and settled in Toowoomba. I think it's now possible, right, via the sort of works that I've just shared with you, to think about, rethink the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, right, and the rootedness or sense of rootedness that diasporas, both from the Pacific region and the Mediterranean region, fostered over the 20th century. And a little side note, apparently I looked up the communal olive grove this afternoon, and they're no longer selling their olives because they had a fire and their olive grove burnt down. And there's also perhaps an environmental story attached to this story of labour and the making of new culture. So my approach to kind of bringing a story of the Mediterranean Pacific together, to think about, say, a sense of belonging on country to a place where people moved to, toiled over, built their homes on, and nurtured their families, has, I hope, the potential to reorientate how we think about diasporic groups and how they use history in the present and shift the prevailing binary, say, between a settler and a non-settler, by recognising intersecting colonial modes of power and the importance of anti-colonial struggles over land, while also positing the existence of other spheres of life and belonging where one can be removed from the operations of power that surround them. I'm interested here then in channeling new forms of rootedness, and I'm always inspired by this essay by Ghassan Haj called Thoughts on Another Australian Belonging, the Fig, the Pomegranate and the Olive Tree, which ends this edited collection here called Words That Made Australia. I'd take a note to say he's the only author in the volume of non-Anglo background, right? So his work has kind of propelled me to consider how it may be possible to historicise open and non-exclusivist forms of rootedness to country that permit an understanding of roots that is not necessarily grounded in stasis and a kind of possessive rooting that's fixed, right? But a way of thinking about how culture moves and shifts over time while still retaining relations to traditional pasts. Okay, so with this kind of framing in mind, let me share this photograph here, the celebration of a peace celebration celebrating the end of World War II in 1919. Posing for the camera are Greek migrants in the rural town of Childers. The man in the centre of the image is Paul Kominos, a distinct relation to the owners of the communal olive grove I mentioned earlier. He was born on the island of Kythera, an island, as quite a range of historians have now uncovered or explored in some depth, that for a large part, I don't need to tell many, say, the Ithacan folk in the room, but for a large part of the 19th century was part of a British Mediterranean that included other islands like Malta and Cyprus, as well as Palestine and Egypt. So in other words, the fathers and grandfathers of Komnenos, who stands here, would have lived in a British imperial domain that was connected via the routes of British imperial oceanic laneways to the southern Queensland hub of Childers. And so gazing at the camera, the men flaunt their proud identification with their civilizational heritage. At first glance, the photograph exemplifies a specific kind of performance. The men are partaking in a provincial peace celebration. They are men sporting togas. The woman above acts as a personified representation of Athena, goddess of wisdom, courage, inspiration, and civilization, law, and justice. She stands on top of a makeshift chariot holding a large Greek flag and a tableau with the depictions of the ancient Olympic Games. So from an initial viewing, we may be inclined, if not encouraged, to see this moment as a story of Greeks negotiating an embryonic Australianness. We may see it as examples of Greeks showing themselves to a British world. But what if we think about the image through the lens of settler colonialism? At a second glance, we might be inclined to consider the land under the horse's hooves, land that would once have stained the palm trees that border the front and back of the chariot. In the marble cafe that Paul Komnenos ran in Childers, an establishment furnished with silky oak fittings and tables with Italian Carrara marble tops, which gave the cafe its name, he would have serviced a large population of transient seasonal cane cutters, many of whom were Greek, my grandfather included. So before he purchased his cafe, Komnenos was himself a cane cutter, and he, along with other labourers, cleared and worked the land behind them, land inhabited by the Dandabara peoples who were part of the Kapi Kapi tribes of the region. The Dandabara would have spoke one of at least 90 languages and dialects that were in use across the landmass we now literally call Queensland. A landmass that was dreamt as having the potential to act as a new plantation society after the abolition of slavery and the American Civil War. So First Nations peoples were moved off this land, and a profit-driven agricultural economy was created. Unskilled South Pacific Island labourers, along with non-white indentured labourers, were, through violent means, recruited on and then deported off the land. So just take note here, right? Greeks, like Captain Seafaring Athanasios Toranos and his brother Angelios, were active in the trade of labour and lives, and between them they transported more than 1,000 people from the Solomons and Vanuatu to the ports of Queensland. The land and its resources upon which material wealth was accumulating had then been taken. Invasive laws and lives and labour that the Greek migrants negotiated radically reconstructed the environment in this image. So in this sense, when we look at it in a different way, we can view this Greek come Australian peace celebration as posturing in a world that is scarred by a colonial presence. They're migrants that have served and are serving settler colonial interests. Through deeper historical observation, we can view the image of Ionians dressed as deities on Dandabara land as a culturally Pacific representation of civilizational prestige, as well as an example of settler colonial culture that is bound up with the processes of Greek diasporization, a process by which Greeks are becoming a new diaspora in a new British Pacific world. So to wrap up, I'd like to dive in or share these two photographs. For me, they constitute a temporal bridge between the early and advanced stages of sugarcane cultivation in Queensland. They forge a historical bridge between a brutally violent exploitative system of indentured labour and of voluntary employment and mobility. And they form a geographical bridge between the Mediterranean ports, Pacific beaches and First Nations lands. And they form a demographic bridge between two incessantly racialised peoples. They represent perhaps social bridges shared between persevering Indigenous peoples, displaced South Pacific Islanders, and, if you will, dispossessing Greek and Italian migrant come settlers. And finally, they form a political bridge between a settler colony and a newly federated settler colonial nation. 901 is an interesting break. Visually, they capture they're very different photographs. One on the right is a cane gang of Greek and Italian cane cutters in Childers in 1917. And the one on the left, a group of men and women from the Pacific Islands working on the Hambleton plantation near Cairns in the 1890s. The picture on the right portrays a moment of relaxation. It is a small cane gang of free labourers. The men have cut the cane behind them. Dirty and unkept, they are informally kneeling An Italian on the left holds a dog still so that it too can be included in the shot. Though their employment in the sugar industry, as I started with the Royal Commission, was questioned by the Australian labour movement, they were legally, if you will, accepted as white, even though their whiteness was questioned. And they benefited from the job opportunities, wages and working conditions won by the labour unions in the preceding industrial conflicts. So in sharp contrast to the other photo, all the labourers are smiling. The picture on the left shows a group of male and female South Pacific Islanders with an overseer on a horse in the background. And they stare back at us. There are no smiles. Many appear fatigued. The woman crouching on the far left rests her head on her hand. She's not making eye contact with the camera's lens. Young and old are huddled together to capture a moment that does not appear to be composed for their own social consumption. Although the varied use of polka-dotted and patterned fabrics and neck scarves point to a social consumption occurred in their lives. The two pictures are separated by a mere 2 decades of political and social interference in the sugar industry. And that's a point I want to try and get across. There is a story in Australian history about South Pacific Islanders in the 1870s and 1890s, and there's a story in Australian history about Southern European labour, right, that occurred in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and onwards. And they're never told in the same narrative. So from a craft traditionally associated with free and non-white labour, sugarcane was ideologically turned into an Australian economic success story. And migrant histories have adopted and celebrated this success story. Initially cultivated and harvested, as you've heard, by labourers from the Pacific, sugar production in Queensland became lauded as one of the only worldwide industries whose workforce could constitute exclusively European labour, albeit Southern European labour that was questioned, as I started with. So with these harsh juxtapositions in mind, I want to kind of finish here by suggesting that thinking about, say, the interrelationship between land, labour and diaspora, diasporas, plural, right, can contribute to and benefit from alternative, if you will, loaded term, decolonial framing of migrant history and conceptual framings offered by diaspora studies and settler colonial studies. I'm interested, if you will, if we think by how Greek civilizational heritage was utilised as a kind of speculative display of assimilation, while also attempting to tie migrant labour from the Pacific and Mediterranean to the same story, I hope I'm going some way towards reapproaching histories of migration that reconsider the limits of a dominant, relatively homogeneous view of mobility and diaspora culture. So if histories of migration are regarded as, say, the histories of, say, Greeks moving from A to B, from alien to citizen, from distinguishable to assimilable, migration stories will be co-opted, right, to play a role in the construction of a kind of singular ethnic story. But if we regard labour and migration as part of the complex and varied histories of many different groups who've come and settled in someone else's land under the umbrella of colonialism, perhaps the issues we engage with, the stories we tell, might bear the imprint of racism as well as interdiasporic relations. Stories which not only acknowledge dispossession and discrimination, but also tell of cultural ferment and hybridity. So I have a bit of work to do in this project, which is emerging for me. And I plan to locate a dispersed archive of diasporic cultural productions. In addition to the visual materials, say, that I've shared today, I hope to engage with ethnic community-generated publications and material culture, as well as personal papers, memoirs, and interviews with later generations of descendants. And I'm also keen to examine the politics of property ownership social relations in the workplace, the gender dynamics of the home and the farm, and the differences and similarities in the responses to racism on the cane fields. So prompted by a diasporic approach to historical studies, and I'm happy to answer questions of what I might mean by that, a kind of new method that I'm trying to come up with here allows me to review, if you will, a settler-colonizer-colonized binary and chart a Mediterranean Pacific world that I hope affords an opportunity to think about the pluralisms that exist in colonial encounter. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Andoni, for that interesting presentation. I might kickstart the questioning with two questions.
Yep.
Firstly, as far as I know, even until the early 60s, people that were sent to Bonegilla, some were still transferred up to Queensland for sugarcane. You okay there, Nick? Can I proceed? Okay. No more surprises, please. As far as I know, even until the early 1960s, some people in Bonegilla were transferred up to Queensland for sugarcane cutting. When did actually mechanisation through sugarcane harvesters sort of take over? And was any backlash when that occurred by the migrant workers? And the second question is, were there any attempts to get these workers organised with the trade unions and so forth, or because it was seasonal work, they probably didn't lend themselves to it as well, so yeah.
Mechanicization of the industry itself was a kind of gradual process that was caught up with all kinds of protest and opposition, because it just significantly meant that you just don't need as much labour. And by and large starts to take full force in the 70s. I forget the exact date, but I think it's called the Queensland Sugarcane Growers Association. From my understanding of that association, there were significant Greeks in the formation of that association. So to kind of break down and think about who's in power and advocating for what interests is something I'm trying to think through, right? So some Greeks managed to, take advantage of what it means to become part of a representative body that can lobby government and represent the cane sugar growers in a particular way. And then the other thing is to think about the personal dynamic of this, is that I'll come to the Bonegilla thing in a moment as well. The personal dynamic is to think about a lot of these the transience of this work was the draw card. If you knew that you're just going up to make a quick buck, to use your body to cut this sugar, and then off you go back down, often to Melbourne, Sydney, or to the various cafes that may have been part of your kinship network that sponsored you out here. I mean, that's a really quick way of accumulating wealth. And so there's something here that I'm really fascinated about, is to think about migration, right? So you come to Australia, you might go to Bonegilla, and now that's another story. It's that post-war period, 2 year, you got land lease on a property. So I assume people went to Bonegilla. If that was attractive to them, they took it up. So there was a federal government concerted effort to kind of put people in that region. But then there's another story of how certain families start to control the operations of a kind of more centralised operation of cane cutting. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just the second part. Were there any attempts by the trade unions to organise workers?
I haven't dived into that much, but it's full of union disputes. And what I have found, it's not particularly about the cane, but in the 1920s, I've come up with it. It was called I always forget the exact name, but it was sort of like the hospitality union, right? And we got quite angry that they were aware that Greeks were hiring their own kith and kin, right, and exploiting them, right? There was these like stories about
Greeks never do that.
right. So taking advantage of traditional kinship relations to make money, right? And so the union were like, we need to unionize these Greeks, and then the leaders of the Greek community, of course, came in to say, no, they're not badly treated, and we're law-abiding good citizens, etc., etc. But it shows that in that early period that there's actually a reluctance to be unionized, and I think later you might see different examples, especially with the mechanization, right? Like how technology transforms the industry. Yeah.
Florence?
My father came to, when they first came to Australia, they went straight to England. So 1923, Dad was 3 months old. Fortunately for my grandfather, he found a job straight away in the mill, a full-time job, which was just unique. Everyone, you either set up a cafe or you were cutting cane. So he was part of the mouse gang. But do you think he could get a job, 4 sons? Jobs were just not handed down. The British, the colonists, kept all the good jobs for their own. And so we had, if you didn't work in the cafes and and like you said, you got exploited by your fellow Greek, life was just horrible. So fortunately for us, our father wrote his life story and he called it An Olive Amongst the Sugarcane. And there's chapters on this, and there's a very painful chapter on 4 boys looking for work. And their father's at the mill, do you think they just can't get jobs? And really, thank God for World War II, and that's what saved them.
Okay. Like as in they enrolled in the army?
Yes, straight away, yeah.
And can you just tell us, what's this mousetrap?
It was called the Mouse Gang, and it was the troubleshooting gang of the mill, so it wasn't a trade as such.
Right.
It was where everything went wrong, it was this is the way Dad describes it. His father, they kind of nicknamed my grandfather Black George. He was very dark and very angry all the time. and you had to, Dad described you had to have a certain strength to stay in this gang. It wasn't easy.
Yeah.
But George couldn't then secure a trade at the mill for his boys. Yeah.
Right. So, thanks, Florence. And I should read your dad's work story. But another way to think about things is that we tend to think about organised labour, right? Like in a modern context, that we even might think about bureaucratised systems of work today. I mean, these were lawless, if you will, jobs. You know, it was not like the authorities are coming to inspect the great, huge state of Queensland to check in on people, right? What I just want to share here in a policy context is that in 1901, white Australia, there are 2 significant acts that are passed by federal parliament in the first year. One is the Immigration Restriction Act, which is the dictation test, and the other one is the Pacific Islanders Deportation Act, which said that any Pacific Islanders that are in the country, that are in Queensland, must be deported by 1907. It was this sort of date. They needed to be out of the country, not allowed to be there anymore. And we're going to replace their labour with new labour. And so it's sort of the Southern Europeans, interestingly, it's not direct. I can't find evidence to say, and now we want Mediterraneans, right? But it happens. And so, one, I want to tell those stories together, but what I'm kind of getting at is that Queensland, as a site, as a zone, is very distinct, sort of non-urban, lawless. You know, you can think about it as a type of Wild West, right? And so therefore, all kinds of weird things would happen in these refineries and dodgy dealings. Yeah.
Use, abuse, and then spit them out.
Hi, my name's Carol Fraser. I'm interested in the relationships between the Greeks and the Pacific Islanders, say particularly I've got a particular interest in Fiji, and because half my family's from Fiji, Indigenous Fijian. So, yeah, I'm wondering about the relationships between Greeks and, say, Fijians. And did the Greeks go to Fiji? Because outside of Nandi at the Market, and I couldn't believe when I saw it, there's a Greek Orthodox church.
Well, sorry, what's your name?
Carol Fraser.
Thanks, Carol. I've always wanted to see the Greek Orthodox Church in Honolulu, but now I have a reason to go to Fiji. So it's like, the answer to that is, I don't know direct. Go on.
One of the very prominent Greeks here in Melbourne, John Sophanopoulos. I think his daughter or son's married to Fijian, and he's in hockey, but he actually helps sponsor that church and gets people to go there and help with the orphans, and a lot of work happens from here in Melbourne.
So, I mean, that was what I was going to say. So I'd be like, how does a Greek church end up in Fiji? Because I can probably be aware. I probably would be aware if a settlement of Greeks settled in Fiji. So the answer to that is then that's a type of diasporic religious thing that's happening in the Pacific, right? Like it's coming from Australia to implant a particular type of aspect of Greek culture on a Pacific island, right? So that allows us to think about the making of Greek culture that's removed from Greece, right? It's attached to Greece, but it's also removed from Greece, and it's being made and supported and funded from here. But your family relations also point to the research that I want to do. I'm like, how can I dive into the social relations, at an intimate family level, but even in the labour level? And there are rumours, but there are real oral testimonies to the fact that these Greek cafes often hired and were therefore the first places to pay Indigenous peoples in these towns. Like, their labour was exploited, they were paid in rations or something like. So there are these types of oral testimonies, and there's also a messy story of how South Pacific Islanders who were not deported then form, particular relations with Indigenous communities on the fringes of towns, near missions, near reservations, and in the 90s, I think, maybe a bit later, like Queensland and then subsequently the federal government acknowledges South Sea Islanders as a distinct Australian ethnic group. Right? It's like a statement. So you are your own peoples that we recognise and you have experienced immense injustice, right? And so what I want to also attach, that's why I'm saying Mediterranean, Pacific, maybe they're the wrong terms at the moment, they're suiting me, is to say, it's not just like a Fiji, right? It's Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomons, right? Bring out here, forced to work in particular ways, and therefore creating a new type of culture in response to the harshness of the reality that they're in. And that's why I share, say, a photo here with the Italian and Greeks to say, it's not just a photo of Greeks, it's a photo of Mediterranean male labourers. They're identifying with a particular experience together, and they are forming a new kind of diasporic sensibility.
I'm intrigued to know what it was that motivated these Greeks from remote islands like Astilores, where my father came from, to come to Australia. Couldn't speak the language, knew nothing about the culture. It's absolutely extraordinary when you think of it.
Yeah. The Kazi, let's be honest with the Kazis in the room, it is an extremely extraordinary migrant, global migration story. You know, this tiny island, it's not a big island, not a huge population, although quite significantly populated in its actual geographical size. So many came to Australia at this early time. So I have like two theories. One is that the multiple colonialisms, as well as the fact that the island before steamships was quite a significant merchant's site. You know, it connected, this map is very useful in thinking about how it literally, you know, this is a French map, so how the French are imagining this tiny island, all those lines are stemming from Castellorizo. It is part of it, it's a node that connects the Levant. These ships are going from Beirut, from Alexandria, Port Said. You know, Port Said is a gateway to India, to Ceylon, to Australia, right? So it acts as a safe harbour that is very cosmopolitan. So that's one thing. It's like it's an interesting site in the Levant, right? Which is a place of all kinds of cultural contact. But then, and that's like how much I can drive this home, I don't know. It depends what the archive can tell me. But Peter Michaelides, who's a tobacco grower and a wealthy, he's the first president of the Castellorizo Association in WA, in Fremantle. This is my theory. How much can I write on? I'm not sure, but I know this, that he spoke 5 languages and he was extremely wealthy due to his tobacco farm. And in speaking 5 languages, he was hired at an honorary level to be the customs interpreter at Fremantle. And Fremantle was the first port that you dock off from Port Said. Like, so the journey is you go from Castellorizo, there'll be people in Port Said, you hop there, hop on the boat, you stop off at Sri Lanka, and then head to Fremantle. And if you wanted to go, you keep going to Melbourne, Adelaide, Melbourne, etc. So there's something about this guy, right, and his power, I think, to let them in Fremantle. Like a significant populace ends up in Perth, and then in Darwin, and then on to Queensland, and also here in Melbourne, etc. So, you know, there's a story about its broader place as a kind of cosmopolitan site of connectivity, and then there's always, right, like an actual, something's actually happened. And so I'm like, how significant was he to write back, explain to people back on the island, there's opportunity here, come here, I'll help you out, we can help you out. And then in the book that I mentioned that will come out, it's like, and I'll just share one little story, is that he was extremely, you know, well-to-do man, and he sold his cigars, his tobacco to, advertisers, sold to the governor. He was a respected businessman. He made a lot of money.
Well, John Giannakis has written a book. Last year there was a presentation on the Michaelides family as well, so you can probably find it online on our YouTube channel.
But the case study that I found is that the Ithacans of Sydney were questioned by the government, be like, you're bringing out young boys to work in your cafes, and he was against this, right? Like I just find an interesting dynamic between leaders of the Greek community in Sydney and leaders in Perth having a sort of stoush over what's the right way to bring Greek youths into the country.
And I think the other story, if you look at early Greek migration to Australia, they were all islander groups. The Ithacans, the Kazis, the Colonials, the Catterians. So if the people were involved in the merchant marine, It also means being exposed to ideas across different parts of the world as well. So the idea of coming to Australia probably surfaces as well. So.
Nick Spartels. Just wanted to ask you a question. If someone came up to you and said, when did the first Greeks come out to Australia, what would you say? What sort of time frame?
So there's this new book by Peter Perinius called Wild Colonial Greeks. And so for a long time it'd be like there were Greeks on the First Fleet as convicts that were arrested in Malta. But his book suggests that there were a few others. So it's like Cook comes and the fleet comes later. So like the answer is like extremely early. And so the point there is to then think about like, yeah, okay, Gusaloris are as part of some kind of imperial overlapping, but so too this British Mediterranean is a very fascinating thing to think about, is that like the Ionian Islands are literally like, this is their flag, you know? So that very early the British have a presence and they're telling the world we were in Australia too. So yeah, it's really early. Wild colonial Greeks.
My name's Arania Tiktakakas. My grandfather actually came to Queensland. We know to the sugarcane industry, and we originate from very northern Greece, Florida.
Yeah.
He came after the First World War. We don't know the exact date. We're trying to do some research. We've only had a little bit of information from Mum, but she's passed on. He was here for 3 or 4 years. She was born in 25, so we know, it was, as I said, after the First World War. He didn't stay here very long because he got ill, and then he managed to return back to Greece and survived in that. But he did say prior to our migration in the late 50s to my mother, Australia's a harsh country, look after yourself.
These are the oral memories I would love to kind of capture, right? Is that there's something going on. I mean, you're 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a few of Florence, 5, people tonight are just instantly shared with, there's some connection to this Queensland thing. And we've all got varied stories from different parts of Greece and different times in the country's history. Now,
I'd like to thank you for the wonderful lecture, and to thank Nick for, bringing us here every Thursday. And I wanted to ask you about Castellorizo and why people from Castellorizo first were in Gaza as refugees before they came to Australia. Of course you know that, I suppose, don't you?
Yeah.
And is that related to what you say about, British Imperial Mediterranean? Is that why they ended up there?
Yeah.
And also, how did the fact that Malta and the Ionian Islands, Cyprus and Palestine, how did the fact that they were all under the British Empire make their fight common?
You mean today? Okay.
Ironically speaking,
Yeah.
both Palestine and Cyprus are under occupation.
Yeah. Okay. I get it. Yeah, I do.
Anyway, yeah.
My memory on this part of the history is a little hazy, but it's like the British mandate. There's a mandate period. France has Syria and Lebanon. Egypt has France has Syria and Lebanon, and Britain has Palestine and Egypt. But there's also a moment where it's really messy, because what happens is these Western powers say we'll sort of protect this island. So there's this little moment where France is protecting Castellorizo, hence the map, and then the Ottomans attack, and they sink a British ship, and people escape, and a ship takes people to Palestine. In terms of the last part of the question, my answer would be that we need more histories, and not to big note this work, is to say we need more histories like this, because if you can relate an experience of being in a British Mediterranean world and relate the stories of the kind of challenges of engaging with that colonial intrusion, right? Surely that has some relevance to the contemporary issues of the present, right? So my thing is to say that there are ways that we can think past the kind of totalizing, homogenizing framing of Greeks coming to Australia, etc., to say, what if we think about the story of a Mediterraneanness as something that is part of a pluralism and a transcultural connectivity that allows us to think about a shared past. And then that shared past has to be related then to our contemporary issues of the now, right? It's like, yeah.
I think we might have to bring proceedings to a close. Thanks everyone for coming. Big round of applause to our speaker, Anthony Predated. And hope to have you back very soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone.